Good evening and welcome to the first monthly Monday conversation at the First Parish of Medfield in this church here. I am Fritz Fleischmann of the Green Sanctuary Committee at First Parish. A word or two about the Green Sanctuary. We are part of the Green Sanctuary movement within the Unitarian Universalist Association. And this is part of our mission. I have to read this because it's a formal mission statement. To raise consciousness about environmental issues and specifically climate change, to motivate our members to undertake personal lifestyle changes, to generate commitment to community action on environmental issues, and to address and seek to prevent environmental injustice. As part of this mission, we seek to foster public debate, and tonight we want to address one possible public policy approach to climate change, which is to set a price on carbon and its equivalents. Among economists, this is a well-established concept. Harvard economist Dale Jorgensen, this is the latest issue of Harvard Magazine, the title story is Taxing Carbon and Boosting the Economy. Dale Jorgensen, co-author of a 2013 book titled Double Dividend, Environmental Taxes and Fiscal Reform, was interviewed for the most recent issue of Harvard Magazine that I just held up. In the introduction to the interview, the magazine's Jonathan Shaw wrote a passage that may just as well serve as my introduction to our panel tonight. So I quote, "As a means of limiting greenhouse gases, a tax on the carbon content of fossil fuels competes with proposals for outright regulations, such as those advanced by the Obama administration, that would limit electric power plant emissions, and with cap and trade systems that let such big polluters trade permits among themselves, always seeking the most efficient means of reducing emissions. No solution to this massive problem will make everyone happy. So the best outcome will involve striking an optimal balance. A carbon tax may do that because it raises revenue, and thus the additional possibility of redeploying those funds in ways that stimulate economic growth." Unquote. That was all Jonathan Shaw in the Harvard Magazine, and I apologize for the long quotation. So in Massachusetts, quite a bit of work, including research, public information, and political advocacy has been done on this issue. The Massachusetts bill for a revenue-neutral carbon tax before the last session of the legislature sought to reduce carbon emissions and slow down climate change, and if passed, would have stimulated the economy and created benefits for households and businesses. Mark Breslau just told me that this bill has now expired and something needs to be resubmitted, which he will tell us about. So we have 4 experts and advocates with us tonight who are volunteering their time to discuss aspects of this work in Massachusetts and to enter into conversation with you. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce them before we begin. So from my left, economist and consultant Mark Breslau is an expert on energy efficiency, renewable energy, climate change, and government budgets and taxes. That's a mouthful. He's currently part of a consulting team that is completing a study for the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources on how to implement a carbon tax in the state. To my left is Jessica Langeman, co-founder of Environmental Tax Reform Massachusetts, a group that now calls itself Climate Exchange. A year ago, she organized the first public forum in the state on environmental tax reform, which was moderated at Babson College, where I teach, by Steve Curwood of NPR, who hosts the wonderful show Living on Earth, which I highly recommend, Sunday morning at 7. To my right is Jinghua Li, my colleague at Babson. She's an assistant professor of media studies, where she has supervised student media projects to promote environmental tax reform and a host of other projects, which she may tell you about. And Steve Bushnell, on the extreme right here, is a climate leader with the Climate Reality Project and founder and CEO of the Climate Store in Walpole, a Massachusetts startup working to build a national retail brand focused on low-carbon living. So we're going to lead off with a brief statement from each panelist that will give an overview of his or her engagement on this issue, then open the floor for questions and conversation.
I'm part of a team that's doing a study for the Mass Department of Energy Resources on how to implement a carbon tax in Massachusetts. Mass already has a very strong set of policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, stronger than almost any state. We tend to be in competition with California, even given that they're so much bigger than us. So we have policies that are intended to get us to, well, we're mandated to get to a 25% greenhouse gas reduction by 2020, which we may or may not make. And then longer term, we're also mandated legally under a law passed in 2008 to get to an 80% reduction by 2050. That's going to be a lot harder to get to, and we, at least in my opinion, don't have the policies yet to get us there. So a carbon tax is one way of adding to those policies, and it's kind of an obvious thing to do, right? You raise the price of fossil fuels and people will use less of them and do other things instead. And economists have loved this idea for a long time. But of course, it's a problematic idea because energy is a big part of everyone's standard of living. We all spend a lot of money on heating our homes and electricity. And in Massachusetts, the biggest one is gasoline. And people don't like the idea of their cost of living going up, nor do businesses like their costs going up. So policies to reduce emissions have mostly been regulatory in nature up until now, where you don't see the costs so directly, or businesses are paying for them, but a lot of it is just not seeing the costs. Part of that is that if you regulate electric power plants, there will be increased costs to reduce emissions, but it's not quite spelled out so much in front of your eyes. And in Massachusetts, it's certainly true that having shifted from coal generation of electric power to other fuels, especially natural gas, has caused electricity prices to be higher than in areas of the country that are mostly reliant on coal. That's just changing now because of the whole boom in natural gas due to fracking. But until recently, that was the case. We have lots of policies here that regulate emissions in various ways and that aid people in doing emissions reduction. So let me just ask, how many people here have made use of the state or the utility subsidies to do energy efficiency in your home? All right, so that's almost everybody here. Right, so it's not, we have a self-selected group here, of course. But of course, we have very strong policies in this state to do that, the strongest in the country by according to the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. A carbon tax would add to these policies and would make it more expensive to buy fossil fuel, which then is hopefully going to shift people and companies and the companies that supply energy toward non-fossil fuel methods of supplying energy and toward more efficiency. I think almost everyone agrees that it would do that. How much it would do it is another question. How much it would do it depends a lot on how big the carbon tax is. So we actually do have a carbon tax of sorts right now through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, otherwise known as RGGI or RGGI, which is the Northeast's cap and trade program on electricity generation. How many people know what that is? Raise your hands again. Few people. So 9 Northeast states actually already have a system for limiting emissions from power plants in which the emissions are capped and power plants can buy and sell permits to emit. But it's a fairly weak system, intentionally so, because the Northeast governors were afraid to raise the price of electricity very much. So a permit to emit carbon dioxide under RGGI right now is selling for a little bit under $5 a ton of carbon dioxide, which is a pretty low price. In Europe, the price is in the 20s, I think. And we're talking about the modeling that we're doing for the state now, and I can say this because it's been put out publicly before, is talking about starting at a price of $10 and going up $5 a year until you get to $30 in the 5th year, which actually is still a fairly modest price. If you think about it in terms that are perhaps easier to understand, since no one knows what a ton of carbon dioxide means to you, that means about a 27-cent increase in the cost of a gallon of gasoline if you have a $30 a ton tax on carbon. So 27 cents is something. It's not nothing. But, the price of gasoline goes up by that much, up and down that much on its own now due to world market forces. So it would probably have, we think, some impact on reducing the amount of gasoline used. But at $30 a ton, it's not going to cause a dramatic reduction. The projections that have been done for our current study, which have also preliminary results have been put out publicly, indicate that a tax of about $30 and then even continuing to go up over time would yield perhaps something like a 15% decrease in carbon dioxide emissions in the state, which is quite substantial. That's as much as we're getting from anything else. We're actually expected to get a little bit more than that from the energy efficiency programs. So it's a lot, but it's not enough to get us to an 80% reduction in 2050. One would need a larger tax to get to that point. Now, of course, people don't like taxes and people don't want their cost of living raised. So if you're going to have an even bigger tax on carbon dioxide, that's going to be very hard to pass. People aren't going to like it. You probably would not be able to pass it, which is where the idea of a revenue neutral tax comes in. The idea of a revenue neutral tax, which Jessica will also speak to, is that you want to raise the price of fossil fuels, but you don't want to hurt people's cost of living or businesses' cost of operation. So you raise the price of fossil fuels, the government takes in a lot of money from doing that, but then the government gives the money back to people. All right? Now, a lot of people's next reaction to that is, well, what's the point? If you're going to take the money in and give it back, how are you accomplishing anything? That's a good question. And the answer to it, which I hope will make sense to you, is that suppose this happens to you. Suppose that you get taxed $500 a year on gasoline and fuels you use at home. So it becomes significantly more expensive to drive. If the government then gives you that $500 back, are you going to spend the entire $500 on buying gasoline? Or will you maybe say, it's more expensive to drive, so I'm going to figure out how to drive less, and eventually I'll buy a more fuel-efficient car, and I'm going to use some of that money just on other costs of living, on whatever else is important to you, like buying lottery tickets or whatever. And the hope is that that's what happens, that when the price of one product, no matter what it is, goes up, you shift your consumption away from that product and toward other products. And that's the idea of what would happen with a revenue-neutral carbon tax. So you're not harming people's standard of living, but you're persuading them to shift away from fossil fuels. We're currently working on the design for this in Massachusetts, on exactly how you would take in the money and how you would give it back to people. There are lots of different ways you could do this. What we've put out publicly in the stakeholder meetings so far about this is that we're considering a few options. And those options are, on the household side, mainly influenced by trying to make sure that low and moderate income people don't get harmed by this. So as it turns out, especially low-income people, say the bottom 20% of the population, which we often call a quintile, a fifth of the population, people at that low level pay very little in taxes. They pay almost no income tax. They pay a very small share of the property taxes in the state, and even a small share of the sales taxes, because although a sales tax is what's known as regressive, meaning even if you're low income, you need to buy things and pay sales tax. We exempt food from it. We exempt clothing from it. Rent doesn't have the sales tax on it. Heating fuels don't have a sales tax. So that most of the things that a low-income person pays for aren't taxed by sales. So if you were to return the money by cutting any of the state's major taxes, you would not actually be helping low-income people very much. So instead of doing that, we've put out a couple of proposals which would say that we're going to take the money and return it to the population either as an equal payment per household or as an equal payment per person. If you did that, a low-income family and a moderate-income family would get much more of the money than they would by cutting any of the major taxes in the state. And the calculations that I've been working on and that other people have done nationally and in other states say that you could actually set it up this way and a low-income family would actually come out a little bit better off than it was ahead without the tax at all. You could give the money back in several different ways. One way to do it would be to make a carbon tax credit that's part of the state income tax system, so that even if you don't pay hardly any income taxes now, the state would actually give you money back from that. Or the state could just send out rebate checks, which a lot of us think might be more effective if you actually got something in the mail. The state's kind of reluctant to do that because it costs money to send out an envelope, and they're actually hoping to get everybody to do everything electronically. A friend of mine who lives in California scanned and sent to me the note that she got in her electric bill last month, in which under California's system, they are actually giving people rebates and sending them, they're not actually sending checks. What they're doing is cutting people's electric bill. They're having the rebate used to reduce your electric bill. But they put a note in with the electric bill saying you are receiving your carbon tax rebate, essentially. So it was very interesting to see. Then on the business side, you also have to ask how you're going to give money back to businesses. And it turns out that what the last year's or the previous version of the legislation that was put out was going to do to return the money was to use the main tax on businesses in the state, which is called the corporate excise tax here. It turns out when we started analyzing it that using that tax was not a very good idea for several reasons. One is that a lot of the biggest businesses in this state, or the biggest places that we spend our money, are actually not for-profit companies. For example, hospitals, where a lot of our money goes, they're almost all nonprofits. Almost all the colleges and universities are nonprofits. And municipalities, cities and towns, which are one of the biggest industries in the state, of course, pay no taxes. So if you had a carbon tax, all those institutions would be paying more tax on the fuel and electricity and gasoline they buy, but they would get nothing back if you cut the corporate excise tax. It also turns out that manufacturers, a sector that we care a lot about, even under current law, only pay the excise tax on in-state sales, that if you're selling out of state, you don't pay it. So it turns out manufacturing industries pay very little corporate excise tax in this state. So for those reasons, we needed to find some other way of giving the money back to businesses. And the two proposals that we're considering, and still waiting for someone to come up with another one, because there might be something better, is to rebate to companies based on their proportion of total employment in the state or total value of payroll. Either of those would spread the money quite widely, and all the institutions I mentioned before, which have lots of people working for them, right, and pay a lot of payroll, would all get back money. And the data that we have so far indicates that that would be a fairly good method of spreading the money. I think those are the main outlines of what we have been talking about in the stakeholder meetings on a preliminary basis. And this is all preliminary because we haven't finished our report, and I should say that the report is simply the report of the consultants. It's not an official document of the state of Massachusetts. It's nothing that the state agency is endorsing, even when it does come out, which it hasn't yet. And there will still, of course, raising the price of energy is still going to be controversial, even if you're returning the money. And of course, some households and some businesses will do better than others.
Psychologically, if you get a rebate on the same bill that you're paying, it just feels like, how is that going to change behavior? I mean, does it change behavior? Maybe it does, but I'm just thinking it's like...
Well, it's a good point. Well, one of the things that's important is that, and people may not realize this, so you may be right, is that if you were doing it on the electric bill, which is what they're doing in California, you don't want to do it on the price you're paying per kilowatt of electricity. You don't want to make it cheaper to buy electricity. What you would do is you would just give them a flat rebate. So it would be like, your electric bill is $100 this month, we're giving you $50 off. All right?
Have a little buzz in between so people will figure out too quickly.
Well, in other words, you're not getting the money back based on how much electricity you consume. All right? You don't want people to think that if I buy a lot of electricity, I'm going to get a bigger rebate. And people might think that, so that's not a good idea. You want them to understand that we're just giving you a flat payment that has no relationship to how much electricity you consume. All right?
It seems to me that getting a check in the mail may well be the most popular way. And didn't they in British Columbia start out by sending people a check before they ever taxed them, or is that?
That's right. British Columbia, which is the one place that's done something very similar to what we're talking about, it's where we're looking to for a model, did what Fritz said. I think they actually borrowed the money or did something in the state budget, and they sent people the checks before they started charging them the extra money. So it's a very unique idea. I don't know if we're going to be able to do that here, but it certainly was a way of getting support for it. So I think those are the main outlines of what we're looking at doing. And I will pass the mic on.
I just want to say that in all the conversations that we have been in about climate change and taxation, the issue of, well, two issues come up. One is how to communicate about it at all. Right. And the other one is the issue of good faith, right? If the government taxes you, are they acting in good faith, or are going to, quote unquote, steal some of that money for their own purposes, right? And so if the money, that's why I love the idea of sending out a check, because it says, here we are, we're acting in good faith, this is for real, right? No?
Well, that leads me to want to say another few seconds anyway, which is there's still a lot of debate about whether revenue neutral is the best idea, or whether you should use at least part of the money to fund good government things, including things that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Public transportation, or more money for efficiency programs, more money for renewable energy programs. So let's just, quick poll in the room. Which of these two things would you rather have? All right, so either revenue neutral or non. So how many people would want this to be, what? What's the third? Yeah.
I mean, why only have two?
Okay. Because it's simple to do two, but go ahead.
Simple, but not necessarily
all right.
Most informed, maybe. None of you yet. I mean, I think education might be an appropriate use, but also, educate people. That might be a better way to do it, but because you increase a bureaucracy. But couldn't you also tax low mileage cars that pollute a lot, an astronomical amount? Do that kind of thing. That might generate a lot of funds, which I don't think is the real point, but.
All right, so you're complicating this more than I want to right now.
The policy's complicated.
Well,
So now I'm just trying to add to it.
Right. So I was just trying to ask a simple question to people. So
You're in fact complicating it by the fact you want to do income redistribution, which is not part of carbon neutral. So you've added a whole bunch of things into this too, as well as increasing the bureaucracy. So you've added elements here that are not part of the original statement, I think. But you've passed over those. So why can't there be other possible solutions? And I think education is a strong one, but
right.
costs nothing. But
Let me just make this generic. So the two choices are either one, revenue neutral, or two, spend some of the money on other good things, which could include education. All right. One could do carbon education as part of the money, use part of the money for that. All right. So let's just see. Raise your hand if you're in favor of revenue neutral. All right. Now raise your hand if you're in favor of using at least some of the money for other things. All right. Well, that's very interesting. Okay.
Just a comment. Again, I've read up on this, particularly British Columbia. If the government sucks all the money, you're going to be very concerned about how much tax there is. And you may not, as you're pointing out, you may not get enough change in people's attitude if it's a $2 a ton carbon tax.
Okay, so
If you make it $70 a ton, you generate a huge amount of money, and you better give it back or it'll never pass.
let's repeat the comments.
So the comment, I think, which is well taken, it's the same way we've been thinking about it, is that if you don't give the money back, you probably will only get a small carbon tax that won't have much effect. Whereas if you give the money back, people will be willing to have a much larger carbon tax that will have much more of an impact. And I agree.
My name is Jessica Langerman, and I'm so grateful to be sitting next to Mark because he can answer really complex, high-level questions, whereas my own background is that of a high school English teacher. And I came to this work in a rather indirect way. I had decided to stay home with my 3 school-age children, and I took up being a stringer for our local paper. And one day my editor asked me to cover a talk by a gentleman from the Union of Concerned Scientists at our library in Wellesley, where I live. So I went down, and over the course of this talk, this gentleman told me, or told the audience, that by the turn of this century, no matter what, really, no matter if some remarkable technology were to be invented, really, it is almost impossible to conceive of something that could stop what I'm about to say from happening. And that is, he said, that by the turn of the century, we here in Boston will have the climate of South Carolina. So it is now 2014. We will have the climate of South Carolina. And that just knocked me over. It was such a, I couldn't believe it. And I thought about my children, and I thought about what that would mean, what it would mean for our oceans. So at that evening, I went home and I joined every environmental group that I could, and I I told my husband that we needed to swap out all our light bulbs for compact fluorescents, and I twisted his arm into buying a Prius. And I joined our local, sustainability groups and so forth. But I became increasingly convinced that nothing that I did was commensurate with the scale and the scope of this problem, until I happened to stumble upon a group called the Citizens Climate Lobby. Is there anyone in the room that's already familiar with that group? Okay, a couple people maybe have heard of it. Okay, so this is a really remarkable group. It's a national grassroots organization, and really what they do is they reintroduce people like me to our democracy. I know I am speaking to a very sophisticated audience, so no doubt you, unlike me, are probably aware of how to make political action happen even at the local level as well as at the national level. I had considered myself quite a politically involved person because I volunteered for presidential campaigns, for example, and I took an interest in gubernatorial campaigns. But I was really unclear on the fact that there is a difference between a federal senator and a state senator, a federal representative and a state representative. I certainly did not know the name of my state representative or senator. So Citizens Climate Lobby helped educate me, and they particularly educated me about what a carbon tax is. And while Mark has done a remarkable job of explaining the concept, I needed a lot of education myself. I needed not only to know what it was, but how to talk intelligently about it. And then I needed to have the guts to pick up the phone and to call my state representative or my state senator. And all of those things Citizens Climate Lobby helped me to do. They actually would put us volunteers in a room together. One of us would play the role of a state senator, and the others of us would actually practice talking about this subject to that person because it's so intimidating. I mean, even to this day, when I talk to people about what I do, I stumble over the phrase, I'm an advocate for a carbon tax. Try saying that. You'll see the wall come down, right? It is a very difficult concept to try to get people excited about. So at any rate, after feeling a little bit more self-confident through volunteering with the Citizens Climate Lobby, and actually talking to my state representative and my state senator, and then to our federal representatives and senators, I became aware of the gridlock that exists on the national level toward a carbon tax, right? We're all aware that, federally speaking, this is just not going to happen tomorrow, which is when we need it to happen. So I was so angry that I decided that, thinking back, how are the slaves freed? How was, marriage rights, how were they promulgated in the United States? How was healthcare finally reformed? It was reformed, all of those things were reformed right here on the East Coast. Vermont was the first to free its slaves before the Civil War. We were the second, and then the Civil War had to break out. Healthcare reform, we all know, that began here in Massachusetts, and the same with marriage equality. My husband reminded me that the states have often been called the laboratories of democracy for a reason, and that is because experimental policies can be tried out on the state level that the federal government might not be ready to do. So at the time that I was kind of becoming aware of this idea, I became aware also that there is a senator named Mike Barrett of Lexington, Sudbury, Waltham, Newton. And Mike Barrett, stunningly enough, a year ago, submitted carbon tax legislation, this legislation that Fritz referred to earlier that just expired. I approached Senator Barrett and asked him how I could be of help to him in passing this legislation. He needed a study. So a group of carbon tax advocates from the Citizens Climate Lobby and I got together, and we found an econometric modeling firm in Washington, D.C. called REMI, Regional Economic Models Incorporated. And we choked up the money. It was $40,000 to fund a study from this firm. We wanted this firm because they also work for the oil and gas industry, and they are considered just the top of the line and the least ideologically biased. So REMI did this study, and it confirmed what Mark has just said, that if we were in fact to implement a carbon tax in the state of Massachusetts, let alone federally, but right here, not only would we not harm our economy, we would improve our economy, and I can give you absolute facts and figures as to how, and we would increase the number of jobs here. It is so counterintuitive, and yet REMI demonstrated it, and even more counterintuitively, the higher the tax goes up to a certain point, the more the economy benefits and the more jobs are generated. So with this study in hand, Senator Barrett has been able to go forward and to really talk up his legislation. He will be resubmitting that legislation in January, and I will be available after the meeting tonight to talk to anyone who would be interested about how you can help us here in Massachusetts with this effort. We believe we really can be the first state in the nation to pass such a carbon tax. The last thing I'm going to say is, things are actually looking real when you sit at your desk and your phone rings and it is a woman offering you $30,000 whom you've never met before, but who has learned about your efforts kind of through her own little grapevine. We have had money come to us, and now we have large foundations knocking at our door, offering money to the tune of $500,000. This is serious, and we can do this here, but we need to build the political will together. So that's what I have to say.
Hi, everybody. My name is Xinghua Li, and I teach in the same college as Fritz at Babson College. After hearing Jessica's, story about how she became an environmentalist, I feel compelled to share my own story. I am from China, Shanghai. That's my hometown, and I was an environmentalist before. When 2006, I watched Al Gore's documentary, Inconvenient Truth. I already lived in the U.S. and I watched that documentary, and it predicted that my hometown Shanghai will be underwater, in 50 years. And I completely went into a panic, and I called my parents on the phone in Shanghai. I said, "You guys better move out of Shanghai as soon as possible." And my dad said, "Don't worry about it. We live on the 11th floor." So, and my mom, she said, "We can even buy a boat and we can visit your uncle across from us." So my reaction to these were not laugh. I was angry, and I thought, how could you guys, not sense the severity of the issue? And this got me thinking that can it possibly be because of cultural differences? That for me, I have stayed in the U.S. For the last 5 years, and I'm familiar with the apocalyptic rhetoric. The day after tomorrow, or I can imagine the world ending so easily, 30 feet high waves, sweeping over. But my parents, as a Chinese, never visually have been exposed to this apocalyptic rhetoric, nor have they been exposed, verbally, because apocalypse isn't really part of Chinese religion. Because Chinese religion mainly is, Buddhism, which conceives time in a circular way, and the U.S., Christianity is more linear way of conception. So I thought, culture must play a huge role in, people's reception of environmental messages. And that was how I got interested in environmental media and how to use media to translate environmental messages to different groups of audience. I taught a class in spring 2013 called Media, Culture, and the Environment. And I had students do a media advocacy campaign. They use media to select a Massachusetts town to educate them about carbon tax. So here's where carbon tax come in. And Jessica very kindly, collaborated with me for this class. She came to my class and talked to my students. And what we're mainly doing is to teach the students to take this idea of a carbon tax, a possibly dry and boring message, and then translate it to the masses. Not as drastically different like China and the U.S., but just different Massachusetts towns. And our experience was that even it's within one single state, the audience's culture difference make their reception to the message very different. And I'm going to get a little theoretical, because so here is something we learned from our campaign. Our campaign, mainly is, learning about communication. And the first lesson is that communication is more than just conveying information. It's about the exchange of ideas and feelings and attitudes and expectations. And from my perspective, I think communication is about bridging divides. I think there are 4 divides that an environmental communicator need to bridge. So I'm going to go with the 4 divides. The first divide is the divide between people and the government. This has something to do, with the general lack of knowledge of citizens. about how political advocacy works. When my students received this project, Carbon Tax, they, to be honest, were not enthusiastic. I have taught same class in the past promoting renewable energy. The students loved it because it has to do with buying something. It has to do with, we're promoting a product, and that's fun, exciting, matches the marketing, technique students want to learn. And this time we're promoting carbon tax, and the number one goal is to discourage consumption of carbon. And that's automatically uncool. And that means that you have to deal with the government, and nobody knows how the government works. Thanks to Jessica, we invited a legislative assistant from Senator Barrett's office, and Senator Barrett, who wrote the carbon tax bill in Mass, and he came in, talked to us about the inner workings of the Massachusetts government. Students learned so much. And we also learned the idea of citizen lobbying, the idea that average consumers, citizens, important difference. Citizens can actually reach out to political representatives and talk to them. That was unimaginable for my students. But what I can talk to politicians, they think of them as images on television, right, or behind news conferences, but never somebody you can talk to. So we learned by talking to them, by downloading a few really cool apps in class, and one of them is called iCitizen. I don't know if you have tried it. So my students, they all have smartphones, and that's what they do all day. So they downloaded iCitizen. This is an app. You type in your zip code, and then it tells you your political representative all the way from the state representative all the way to Obama. And there's their email address and phone numbers. You can just click and you can call Obama right in class. And one of my students got bold, and she actually called her state representative or her district representative in class when we were all holding breath. And it's like, oh, what's gonna happen? And we called, and it was not a disaster. We thought it was. The person answered the phone was the assistant to the politician she wants to receive, and she said, I want to inquire about this current mass House bill about carbon tax. And the person said, oh, really? You were interested in this? She was very surprised that somebody would call her about this. And my student said, what's the stage? What status is this current bill? And she said, it's still in the long process of being discussed, so far away from becoming reality. And we were a little discouraged, but we couldn't get much out of this short phone call. But after she hung up, everyone felt like they've been through a roller coaster ride. I mean, you just transcend like the classroom, and then you're talking to someone in the government, and that was pretty fun. This is first divide, bridging people and the government. The second divide is bridging the divide between different social groups. So Eco-America, it is a environmental marketing agency located in Washington, and they've done this very successful survey, American Climate Value Survey, and they analyzed American attitudes towards climate change according to their demographics. So the measurements are education, politics, income, age, and gender. Can you guess which one is the most divisive demographic in terms of attitude towards climate change? Education, politics, income, age, gender. Really?
I would have said politics.
Politics. Yes. With all other all other elements, there are ambiguities. There's general division according to education, not that clear. Income, age, gender, there's no generalizable data. But it's sharply divided between the left and the right, the liberals and the conservatives.
Thank you, Koch brothers.
Huh?
Thank you, Koch brothers.
Yeah, thanks to different ideologies and media that we consume. So this poses a challenge. How do we bridge this divide, political divide? To answer this question, this will bring me to my third divide. Will answer the question provoked by the second. The third one is the divide between reason and emotions. So when you're communicating to an audience, a lot of times we assume the audience are rational. It's a joke. Really?
Not tonight.
I think we're all very rational here. But actually, psychologists said, our mind are not most of the time do not function rationally, but it's most of our brain activities are unconscious, and they are wired to respond emotionally to words, stories, metaphors, images, and the way they are like hardwired in our brain that they are, use the word from George Lakoff, a linguist. Oh, I need to speed up. Okay, so he says, the idea, these words and images and ideologies in our brain, they are wired together in the synapses of our neural circuits. And you trigger one, and the whole series just lights up. And this is, therefore, it's very important for us to know how these concepts, images, words are connected to each other. And then do not push the wrong button. So the idea is that in this types of neural circuits, or this link, so George Lakoff says there are these most divisive is between the liberals and the conservatives. He called them the liberal frame versus the conservative frame. The liberal frame have a collection of words such as governmental regulation, care for the self, for others, for society. When the conservative frames are more like free market, God, religion, and these circuits are so connected that you cannot argue about them. So the idea is that you cannot prove, you cannot refute somebody's frame just by saying that's wrong, because actually the more you say it's wrong, the more you activate that circuit. Right, so every negation is an affirmation. So the example is like Nixon. He said, "I'm not a crook." So as communicators, we have to think very carefully. So brings me to my key point, which is carbon tax. So which circuit does it belong to? Definitely emotional circuit, and it's probably linked together with the liberal frame, with the governmental intervention, and probably linked to the whole series of liberal language, education or. Oh, actually, I was surprised to see that Eco America said the liberals are also associated with like sushi eating, bike riding, So apparently they're all in a big basket of words. So I think the choice of words is so important in promoting carbon tax. And my students, they did that by avoiding the word tax. Don't know if that's will really happen in a real carbon tax campaign, but my students they prefer to call it putting a price on carbon, or say make polluters pay. So you avoid a tax, this term, because it's just too divisive. So I will stop here and can discuss more in the later Q&A. Thank you. Thank you.
My name is Steve Bushnell. Maybe I'll tell my story briefly also in terms of how I got involved in climate change and why I think it's so important. I'm a mid-career person. I'm a scientist and engineer by training. I spent about 18 years of my career in biotech and pharmaceuticals and engineering, and I was recently impacted by one of the many restructurings in today's society that we see, and at mid-career really felt that I needed to make a change in direction. Always had a concurrent interest in the environment. I read Bill McKibben's books, pretty much every single one, and really felt that, having had some time to think about it, went back and read a lot of the reports to answer for myself how serious a problem is climate change. So I had the pleasure of some time to read the IPCC reports and really go back to the original papers. And I must tell you, I came away from that experience really, really concerned. So very similar to Jessica's story. I see climate change coming like a freight train. I am absolutely struck by the significance of the gap between kind of where the general public is at with respect to the issue and their knowledge base and what the scientific community is telling us. The scientific community is no longer questioning this anymore. It's unequivocally true. Climate change is real. What they're really talking about now is what's going to happen and how fast. And, one of the most striking things from all the reading I did that I learned along the way was something called the lag effect. And so one of the significant, if you will, principles around climate change that's not really discussed too much is the fact that our window of opportunity for addressing this problem is closing very quickly. And I don't think we really appreciate that. And that's for two reasons, one of which is greenhouse gases, in particular CO2, it's the gift that keeps on giving, which means that for every ton of CO2 we put up in the atmosphere, it hangs around for thousands of years. And there's lots of dynamics and cycling in terms of where it goes. But the point is that, when we pollute every year, as we all do living in our fossil fuel economy, the effect of that pollution is very, very long-lived. That's the first thing. The second thing about the lag effect is the oceans are really slow to heat up, but once you heat them up, they don't cool down. So, the reality is we have a very significant, I hate to be kind of a downer here, but we have a huge problem on our hands. And we need to use every tool we possibly can to start shifting our behavior. And of course, I personally think the carbon tax is the only way that we're really going to have a chance of stopping this. But we can come back to in a minute. So my approach to this was also reflecting on how do we do a better job communicating and getting the story out. Looked around and looked for opportunities for how do we educate people, and felt that there was not enough going on in, of all places, retail. So I'm very pleased to hear that kids at Babson want to buy things, because I'm actually starting a company. I've just started a company called The Climate Store. It's a very simple brand, and it's meant to be simple for a reason, because I believe that there's an opportunity in the retail space to teach people about climate change. And I'll say a little bit about that. Only 2% of people today, or 2% of our population in general, work in agriculture. Now, if you go back 100 years and 200 years, right? I don't know the exact statistic, but it's more like well over 90%. All of our grandparents and great-grandparents were part of a very rich and deep agrarian society. You look today at the workforce and where our food supply comes from, it's a very small part of our society. People don't have a connection with nature anymore, and that's another challenge with respect to communication. Fritz, I know you talk about this in your classes too. So the idea of the Climate Store is to try to create a brand where people can kind of start to reconnect with nature, maybe a different way, but learn about climate change, and at the same time find products and ideas that will help them reduce their carbon footprint. So I'm an entrepreneur, recently, and I'm starting this company with the idea of creating a brand where people can learn about climate change and find solutions. Because I believe that a lot of people are starting to come into the issue, that there may not have been green buyers in the past, but climate change is different. And because it's different, we believe in our company that people will come in to the climate space and actually want to do something, want to start reducing their carbon footprint, but won't know how. So climatestore.com is about that. So if you can go to the website and check it out and learn for yourself kind of what the company's about. I did want to turn back to the carbon tax because I'm a small business owner, and we have our offices over in Walpole, and you might be wondering, well, what do small businesses think about carbon taxes? Actually, my feeling is I think it's going to be great for companies that move quickly to reduce their own carbon footprints and adapt to the changing legislation. So I think it's going to give us a competitive advantage. I believe that our company is working to be a very sustainable. We have a zero carbon footprint. We have all kinds of efforts and initiatives to make sure we are low carbon. But working in the framework of a carbon tax is going to create a greater impetus for us to move forward. So I personally think it's going to be good for our company. I would say that the real issue, or one of the significant issues to passing legislation, it seems to me, is the issue of interstate commerce. So, we don't, most companies now are far more than regional, they are international. And so when you start placing taxes regionally, the question is, how are companies going to compete effectively when they are operating in global marketplaces? So I guess maybe to turn the question back to Mark and others on the panel, I think one of the things that we should talk a little bit about is how do we address the regional and the global kind of competitive aspects of carbon taxes in terms of their impacts. But, so
the floor is open for discussion. I want to thank you all, before we start the conversation, for really interesting introductions and stories about what you do. Questions for any one of the panelists?
What about his question?
Mark, do you want to respond to that first?
It's less of a problem in Massachusetts than in most other states because we lost most of our industry a long time ago. So if you think about what this state lives on, it's mostly things that are not energy intensive. The biggest industries in the state are professional services, lawyers, doctors, computer consultants, economists, etc. Relatively low energy types of work. Real estate is a big industry, education, hospitals, non-hospital healthcare. None of them have very large percentages of their expenses going to energy. And they're also not, for the most part, not very mobile businesses. Well, there's a mix on that. But most of those things are not going to be driven out of state by a carbon tax. Manufacturing tends to be the place where you have to worry about it the most. We don't have hardly any heavy industry in this state anymore. There's other states where it would be a much bigger problem. The biggest manufacturing sector that we have is computers and related equipment. And according to our calculations, that's not that energy intensive, and it's fairly labor intensive. We think, to the best we can do the calculations, that industry would actually come out ahead between the carbon tax and giving the money back per number of employees. There are a few manufacturing sectors in the state that would come out behind, and there is some worry about that, and that's something that we're looking at now.
That's great news for Massachusetts, and I think will serve the process of politically, succeeding in terms of getting a new bill. Certainly, from my perspective, to really effectively address climate change, we need a national tax, and so the question, or one of the, I guess, technicalities of the legislation will become important is how do you close some of the gaps internationally and from an interstate perspective, should that be required? So hopefully there's some creative solutions to that. I'm sure there are.
I'm speaking as a Chinese person. In China, the dynamics between local government and central government is the opposite. The central government are, devoted towards changing the environment, solving the crisis, and the local government is the delinquent one. And I just think, by comparison, in the U.S. it's very strange. And I attended the carbon tax panel that Jessica organized at Babson last year. And some economists they said in this country any kind of like the Congress is so paralyzed from doing anything that the change has to come from state. And but I am with you actually. I think. Yes, it can only come from the state, but it'll only work with one state, and it'll just move one state by another state, and so I have no solution to this question, but I do think that this is a thing for us to think about, like different national politics, how they work differently. Because I think a lot of times I blame China's government for being too big and too authoritative, but. On the other hand, it seems like on the environmental front, a centralized government actually might work better.
Yeah.
So I don't. Well, okay. So I would just love to address that question because your comments are so astute. So speaking for myself, what I have learned is that the Citizens Climate Lobby and any real carbon tax advocate wants a national carbon tax. Our problem is that our national government is dysfunctional at the moment. So we do have precedents for environmental laws passing on state levels that make no sense. For example, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act both began state by state. I mean, think about how crazy really that is, but states began developing their own clean air and water legislation. And finally, what happened was a tipping point was reached once the political will had begun to gather enough and state after state began implementing its own different water and air acts. Finally, the federal government came up with the Clean Water and Air Act that was, for the entire nation. So this is not optimal. We want a federal carbon tax, but by God, if we won't get one on the federal level, then we will take this fight to the state by state. And I just want to add that we have Maine, Vermont, and Oregon right now on our heels. In fact, we may not be the first. It may be Vermont who beats us, but we're not alone in this. It is possible to enact a statewide carbon tax. This interstate commerce clause concern has been addressed by Senator Barrett. I'm not sure how, but that's not going to stop this. So we need to find ways, however, to persuade particularly business people that this can happen and be beneficial.
Great, thank you. Question?
When Senator Barrett resubmits the bill, how is it going to differ from the old bill?
Oh, right, thank you. So when Senator Barrett resubmits the legislation in January, how will it differ from the original bill? So the original bill was not at all revenue neutral. Like a good Democrat, Senator Barrett wanted to use the funds, in this particular case, kind of ironically, to help shore up, in particular, roads and bridges. 95% of the funds were going to be used for transportation infrastructure improvements. Ironically, for cars and other, fossil fuel-driven things. 5%, however, was going to go toward renewable energy resource development. Since our REMI report came out that I referenced earlier, and now the Department of Energy Resources study, which Mark is working on, Senator Barrett is waiting for the results of this most recent study to determine how to draft his legislation so that it does not harm the poor, it does not, adversely affect businesses, and it keeps our state competitive, and it is politically saleable. So the answer to your question is we don't know yet. Much will depend on how the study, what the findings of this DOER study reveal.
I grew up in Kentucky, and perhaps all of you are aware that the state to the east of Kentucky is West Virginia. and West Virginia is basically totally reliant upon coal mining. And it's very hard to realize or even envisage how that state government would ever, unto itself, pass something that would be so antithetical to all the people who live there. And yet, and this is, I think, true geographically. I think, for instance, if you, and I don't know about this because I didn't live there, but if you lived in Kansas, would you say be very concerned about the Atlantic Ocean?
Right.
You know, you don't see the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
You're not worried about whether you're on the 11th floor or in the basement. So it so depends upon environmentally where we live and what we have available to us. And it's going to be very difficult, I think, for places like West Virginia to persuade the inhabitants to have a carbon tax.
Well, I think your points are all very well taken. And I would respond, I think, by going back to the cap and trade legislation that was proposed early in the Obama administration. There was a bill called Waxman-Markey, our Congressman Markey at the time, that was going to create not a carbon tax, but cap and trade, which has many similarities. Limit the amount of carbon that can be emitted, and that in effect puts a price on it. And in that bill, there were a whole variety of mechanisms on how to use the money that the federal government would take in from selling the permits under cap and trade. And the money was going to be used in a number of ways to try to ameliorate some of the harmful impacts that it would have on Kentucky, West Virginia, and actually not only there, but all the states in which electricity is mostly generated by coal still. So a lot of the money taken in under that bill was going to be recycled back, based essentially on how emissions intensive your electricity was. So that was one attempt to aid people. And then I think there was also some money for trying to aid people who would be dislocated from their jobs. So on the national level, I think you would need to do these things for a carbon tax. You would need to try to address the differences between other states. And it's certainly true that Massachusetts and Vermont can propose this because we would be among the least affected states.
I was just going to quickly say, through Citizens Climate Lobby, I was lobbying in Washington a couple of months ago, and I was speaking to senators from Kentucky, and that was not a really pleasant conversation. And Remy has also conducted a national study, and it has broken down the results by region into, I think, 6 different regions. And what is extraordinary is that the only region that would be negatively affected by a national carbon tax it's quite small. It's like the region that it contains Louisiana, basically the oil refinery regions. So the gentleman from Kentucky said to me, I am not interested in your foolish nonsense about climate change, which we all know is a hoax. He said, but I am interested in jobs. So if you can show me that a carbon tax will produce jobs, well, we can. We have hard data to show that. So I would love to talk to you later because we need to increase our visibility in states like Kentucky and convince people there that this is true.
How do you deal with that mentality when they said there's no such thing as climate change? That scientists, if that information gets out, and I've talked to more people that, I heard scientists, I heard this congressman or this senator say, how do you deal, and that, which was your point on education, how do you deal with that to correct that and get that factual information out there?
The question is, how do you cope with climate deniers, basically? And Xinhua, you perhaps should be the best qualified to talk about this, but we have been trained to understand that the language is monumentally important, that conservatives will respond to language like protecting the sanctity the purity of our environment. Ronald Reagan himself called pollution a form of fascism because someone's pollution is interfering with my private property. So you cannot deal with these people by using reason. You cannot deal with them by using facts, by studies, by the IPC. You can't. You have to instead go a completely different tact and appeal to their patriotism, as in, when did America fall behind in its leadership of the world? You know, we could be leading the world on this issue, protecting the sanctity of our virgin forests from, I am serious, this is the language that appeals to them. Are we going to let, England get ahead of us in green technology? We used to lead the world. Germany is now the greenest country on earth. My God, what is, so you in my experience, you take this you don't even talk about climate change. Talk about jobs, patriotism, competitiveness, virginity, right. And then you'll really be in good, okay, so Xinghua, do you have?
I just want to echo what Jessica has said, but I think this is more than just playing of words, though. On a certain level, in communications, we always talk about reality versus perception of reality. So we always assume that there's an objective reality out there that's going to happen and is gonna affect everybody. But within the communication study, we talk about reality itself as as a subjective experience, and it's created by language, by our communication media environment. So you live in that reality, and in the U.S. overall, the populations are so divided in the type of media that they consume that a person watching Fox News would have no knowledge about what the MSNBC or Democracy Now! Is talking about. Everybody's media experience are fragmented, and there's less and less overlap between us. It's sad because I don't want me to sound cynical, but nowadays we have so much choice of media. We can choose to consume the things that we like, things that we want to hear, words that we want to hear, and things that we makes us happy. And everyone gets pleased in their own way, but we lose this common ground, this public forum that people can come together and debate about the same issue. So I think one way to do this is kind of encourage people to simply open up their media consumption appetite and tell them to kind of break free from the narrow types of media that they consume, and then listen to different types of voices. But then again, that's a long-term solution. And it probably is too slow.
I'll maybe try for a shorter answer to that. I think in Massachusetts, this is probably going to play out to be very important. There's definitely deniers out there, and they're very verbal deniers. Now that I'm in climate change and I have a brand around this, our brand is actually targeted. So I spend part of my week literally interfacing with deniers in the social media space because they're targeting our company. It's astounding. But what I'm seeing is there's a whole level of people who are just still who just have doubts. They're not so sure. Yeah, I was going to say there's a level of, I believe, a slice of society that is, they're not deniers, but they're kind of, slight doubters. And I think that's the bigger problem. I'm not worried about the 5 or 10% of people who will have a really hard time reaching. I'm really worried about the 30 or 40% of the population that are, that's natural variation. It's not natural variation. And Al Gore wrote a fantastic piece in Rolling Stone about 2 years ago, and he asked, what can people do? And one of the things he said at the end of the article was, as individuals, whenever we come across folks who are sitting on the edge and are talking about natural variation and long-term effects, we have an obligation to stop everything we're doing and say, that's not fact, okay? The fact is really something completely different. You know, this is real. Let me get you talk to, you know, find somebody, educate yourself on the science, or, you know, find resources, but it's really important for us as individuals to really make a verbal stand around this, I think. So,
I wanted to invite folks, if they'd like to continue this discussion, I'm a member of Temple Beth David down the road in Westwood, and we just happen to have on our schedule a talk that I'm going to give this Sunday at 11:15, Temple Beth David in Westwood. I've been 35 years in the energy efficiency field, and I think I've come to Mark, and I think we've crossed paths a couple of times. Fred Davis is my name. Anyway, we're going to deal with not carbon tax per se only, but climate change, and particularly we're going to bring up talking about the emotional side of this and the cognitive dissonance that we all have to go through, whether it's denial or not. It's a lot of change we have to go through. We're going to bring up Noah, the story of Noah.
I want to thank you for saying that, because part of what this forum is about creating community around these issues. So we do want to reach out to other congregations.
I don't know that's so much a question, but more of a statement that I think if we also frame all of this more in the terms of jobs, that there would be so many more people latching onto this. Because the argument has always been it's jobs versus the environment. And if you call something a jobs bill instead of a carbon tax bill,
That's right.
probably,
Good idea.
what are you going to do? You're going to say, I'm against creating jobs? You know, you'd be forcing politicians to line up and get their name on it, to sponsor it.
Great idea.
I love all of this, but how do you fight people like the Koch brothers? What's your plan of attack?
Say something? Okay, all right. I'll say just one last thing. The question is, how do you fight the Koch brothers?
Or any company like that?
Or the money that is overwhelming us all. So one way is that we all join Root Strikers, which is talking about election reform and how we can make elections be less connected to money. But Barney Frank said something really, really moving a couple of years ago. He said that people like us are so politically disconnected that he will hear from crank after crank all day long, or paid lobbyists, but so few rational voters actually take the time to pick up the phone and ask him for something. So he said if he gets one phone call from a rational citizen, that's a surprise. 2 is a coincidence. 3 is, three is like a pattern, and 6 is enough of a groundswell that he will vote. He will change his vote on a bill. I mean, he will be persuaded to that degree. Imagine if each of you tonight went home, or tomorrow, and called your state representative and state senator. Even the Koch brothers, they cannot buy our vote, right? That is what keeps these politicians in office, but they have to hear from us. So I am really imploring you, if you would consider tonight signing up with our little group called Climate Exchange, and we can help educate you and tell you about this effort in Massachusetts, and we can together build that political will.
This is a great hopeful note on which to conclude this evening. I thank you all for coming, and let's give our panelists a round of applause for a really great job.
This program was made possible through the generous support of your Medfield friends and neighbors, folks just like you. And thanks for watching.